So today is the last Sunday of February, and February is designated as Black History Month. I think it's a good opportunity to be reminded of our commitment as Christians for racial equality and justice. So Black History Month is an annual observation originating right here in the United States, also known as African American History Month. It has received official recognition from, of course, the United States, but also from Canada. And more recently, actually, Ireland and the Netherlands and the United Kingdom have also joined in having an African American or Black History Month. So it began as a day of remembering important people and important events in the history of the African diaspora. Black History Month was first proposed by black educators and by the black United Students at Kent State University in 1969. And then the first observance of it was a year later, in 1970. What you may not have known is that there was a precursor to Black History Month called Negro History Week. Negro History Week was created in 1926 here in the United States when historian Carter Woodson, you see his picture in front of you, and the Association of the Study of Negro Life and History announced the second week of February to be Negro History Week. They chose that date, that week, because Abraham Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, and Frederick Douglass's birthday on February the 20th. So Black History Month has its critics on both sides of the racial divide. For instance, actor and director Morgan Freeman, who many of you enjoy his movies very much, I do, and actress Stacey Dash have criticized the concept of declaring only one month as Black History Month. Freeman said, "I don't want Black History Month. Black history is American history." So Freeman is certainly right about that, right? But unfortunately, without some emphasis or an opportunity to focus on black history, it often gets overlooked. Now, I'm not here to argue for or against Black History Month this morning, but I am here to argue for a better understanding of the unjust treatment of people of color in our country's history. And I'm here to call for a commitment to a greater sensitivity to and a greater commitment to change any ongoing racial inequality or injustice in the present. I want to declare as clearly as I can today that the God who made us and the God whom we serve is not prejudice. Our God is not racist. God's will and God's plan for the Church of Jesus Christ is multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-economic. A family bound by love. Sadly, tragically, the church, from its very inception, has struggled to live out that ideal of one people. Let's spend a few minutes reviewing the history of race relations in the churches of Christ. And I'm gleaning some of this history from this great resource that I actually have, the Encyclopedia of the Stone Campbell Movement, which is part of the churches of Christ, right? So, Americans of African descent, both slave and free, were present in congregations here in the United States of the churches of Christ almost from its inception in the early 1800s here in our country. But in the hardening of attitudes that followed the Civil War, black Christians who had previously been a part of white congregations, even though they had to be seated in a separate area, were now systematically excluded, or they were encouraged to form separate, segregated congregations. Now, David Lipscomb, for whom the college in Nashville is named, he stood against this. He protested this practice. He advocated for full fellowship for all races. But it was to no avail in our brotherhood. So at the beginning of the 20th century, 3 prominent black evangelists were writing reports and articles regularly for journals of the Churches of Christ. S.W. Womack, Alexander Cleveland Campbell. I couldn't find some pictures of some of these guys. They worked in Tennessee, and they wrote for the colored page in the Gospel Advocate. Samuel Robert Cassius, a former slave and a tireless evangelist, worked in the Midwest. And he wrote for several periodicals, including the Gospel Advocate. Now Cassius attempted to found a school that followed the model of Booker T. Washington, kind of an industrial school. It didn't come to be. But in Tennessee, 2 younger men, George Philip Bowser and Marshall Keeble, both influenced by Booker T. Washington, began careers of lasting significance. Bowser was a preacher and a printer. He opened a school in Nashville in 1907 along the lines that Cassius had proposed. It was the first of several academies in which he aimed to educate preachers and also church workers who would be self-supporting. He published the Christian Echo, the first avenue of communication among black churches that white brethren didn't control. Although black members participated in integrated congregations of Churches of Christ outside the South mostly, but in some pockets of the South, most black members of Churches of Christ gathered in black churches. And in 1927, Bowser could list 26 different independent black congregations in our country with a membership of about 1,165. Now, Marshall Keeble is a name that many of you may be familiar with. He was the son-in-law of S.W. Womack, who I mentioned a minute ago. He began preaching in 1897. He became a traveling evangelist by 1914. And after 1920, with full support from white wealthy brethren, Keeble traveled throughout the South and beyond, becoming the most successful evangelist in Churches of Christ. And that's most successful evangelist in any churches of any color, white or black, the most successful. In 1931 alone, Keeble preached 14 campaigns, planted 6 new churches, and baptized 1,071 people in 1 year. After 1942, Keeble presided over the Nashville Christian Institute that had been established by white Christians to train black preachers and workers. Southwest Christian College, which some of you may be familiar with, in Terrell, Texas, was founded in 1950. And it was established to train black preachers and church leaders in a segregated environment. At the time, Pepperdine College in Malibu, California, was the only integrated college amongst the Churches of Christ. Now, in an article in the Christian Chronicle in 2018, told the story of a historic gathering of 40 preachers, white and black preachers in our brotherhood. They gathered in Atlanta in that tumultuous summer of 1968 to discover and discuss ways to improve race relations among Churches of Christ. That 2-day national meeting came less than 3 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. One of the organizers a black preacher named Eugene Lawton, longtime minister of the Newark Church of Christ in New Jersey. He got right to the point, describing his view of racial discrimination. He said, "It's paved streets on one side of town and unpaved streets on the other side. It's wall-to-wall carpet on one side of town and wall-to-wall rats on the other side. It's having to sleep in your car beside the road because there's no place in the inn. It's being a member of the Church of Christ and being unable to attend a Christian college without going to Southwestern Christian College or 1,500 miles to Pepperdine." Andrew Hairston, a black minister who served as the conference host there in Atlanta, served nearly 56 years as minister for the Simpson Street Church of Christ in Atlanta. He said, "Racism was rampant in churches of Christ. We were not accepted in the white churches except for the back seat or by special invitation. And the thing that hurt me greatly was for us to be saying, 'There's one church.' We were obviously divided." Dwayne Evans, a white minister who attended the meeting, he came from West Islip, New York. And he said, "I thought, my goodness, our public schools are desegregating, but the churches of Christ are as white as they can be and as black as they can be." And this caused Evans to advocate for bringing Christians of all races together. Another white attendee, John Allen Chalk, who preached for the Herald of Truth radio program at the time, said, "My experience with sin and all the principalities and powers and world rulers of darkness, just my understanding theologically of the human condition, caused me all through this period to realize we were really battling, as we still do, some very strong forces of evil." Most of us at that meeting were blinded by our own cultural training and blinded by the evil one. The discussion in Atlanta was frank. Humphrey Fouts, a black minister for the Central Church of Christ in Baltimore for nearly 50 years, said, "You want me to lift myself by my own bootstraps, but you're standing on my boots." At the end of the Atlanta meeting, a statement was produced, quote, "Acknowledging the sin of racial prejudice in the churches of Christ and church-related institutions and businesses." And it set out specific guidelines to remedy the evil in congregations, schools, Herald of Truth, publishing houses, and Christian-owned businesses. Now, none of the attendees of that historic meeting claimed that the Atlanta meeting eliminated racism in churches of Christ, but each characterized the gathering as a success, in that black and white ministers formed stronger personal relationships with each other, and church publications and media ministries gave prominent attention to the issue of racism. So here we find ourselves, over 50 years later, and we're still trying to get it right as a church, as a nation, with regard to race relations. And I'm thankful that since my involvement in Churches of Christ, from age 12, Churches of Christ here in Central New York, that all my experiences have been multiracial and integrated. Over the years, I've been a member at 3 of the congregations here in Central New York: Southside, Wetzel Road, and the former East Side that no longer exists. And all 3 congregations were made up of different races. And I love the fact that our church here at Wetzel Road is a mix of people. We have different colored skin. We have different cultural backgrounds. We have different continents that we've lived on. We have different educational experiences. We have different economic status. And yet, we're trying to be one family. We have to keep in mind that each of our experiences in this congregation are unique to who we are and the challenges that we face in our own congregation and outside of our congregation. Now my only experience during my almost 50 years in Churches of Christ here in central New York, my only experiences have been as a white, middle-class male with an intact family. That's the only experience I can have, right? Because that's who I am. But my experience has been one where I felt welcome and accepted and cared for. But would that have been my experience if I'd been somebody else? Had I been a black man of any economic status or educational status or family status, would I have felt as welcome and cared for and accepted? I hope so, but I don't know. Or how about if I'd been one of our women, whether white or black, or whether one of our immigrants, or one of our ones who are very sick, or very poor? What would have been my experience? See, this is why we have to be so sensitive. And we have to listen for understanding, because our experience may be very different from what other people are experiencing in the same family. Allow me to remind us of the fundamental truths of Christianity with regard to racism. Racism is sin. Racism is evil. Racism is a lie. Racism is anti-Christian. It's anti-gospel. Why? Because we believe that every person is created by God with equal dignity and equal worth. Why? Because every person is created in the image of God. And therefore it's a sin to treat anyone unequally or unjustly or unfairly or dismissively on the basis of race or on the basis of anything else. And it's wrong to presuppose our own race or our own nationality is somehow inherently superior to another. That's crazy. As Christians, we believe, and we must state clearly, there's no place in the church for racism. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news, right? The good news that God loved the world so much. The world. Humanity. People of all nations, colors, right? For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son to die in our place on the cross so that we could be reconciled with God and reconciled with each other. Revelation and chapter 7 and verse 9 reminds us that God's kingdom is designed by God to include people from every tribe and nation and people and language. Racism is contrary to the very goal of the gospel, that God would receive glory from all people of every nation, tribe, and language. The good news of salvation in Jesus is for all humanity. It's a message of hope in a very dark and hate-filled world. Therefore, we must understand and declare that racism is sin and that everything racism stands for, whether it be prejudice or discrimination or antagonism or injustice against someone of a different race, is an affront to God and is an affront to the gospel. As a church, we must be committed to resisting and opposing racism and must be committed to opening our hearts and our lives and our doors to all people of every ethnicity and nationality and color. And as individual followers of Christ, I want to encourage each of us to be asking God to show us, each of us, do I have any blind spots? Do I have any ways that I don't even realize that I'm somehow being prejudiced or discriminatory? Any way I'm in any way contributing to some kind of systematic racism? Show me, God, because I don't want to be a part of that. I want to close the sermon with two encouraging stories. And the first is the story of Daryl Davis. Now, Daryl Davis was once an aspiring and successful musician. He played with the likes of Chuck Berry and B.B. King and Jerry Lee Lewis and Muddy Waters. However, his true claim to fame, the legacy he has forged, came in a very different way. Listen, he went out of his way to befriend KKK Grand Wizard Roger Kelly. He spent years building a trust between them, laying a foundation of what became a friendship. They welcomed each other into their homes. They broke bread with each other at their tables. Davis even went so far as to attend KKK rallies with Kelly. Most importantly, Davis cultivated an atmosphere of listening. And Davis didn't hate Kelly, even though Kelly hated Davis. So instead, he listened to Roger Kelly, and eventually Kelly began to listen to him. This led to the two of them realizing they had far more in common than not. And in the end, Kelly denounced his ties to the KKK, and so much so he handed his hood and his robe over to Davis as a gift. But it doesn't stop there. In total, Davis has seen over 200 Klan members walk away from the KKK, and more than 25 of them have given him their hoods and robes. Daryl Davis is a world changer, replacing hate with love, because love conquers hate every single time. How's that for a remarkable man? How's that for a remarkable approach to trying to overcome racism? And in case you're wondering, Daryl Davis is a Christian. The other story comes from last Sunday's Syracuse Post-Standard newspaper. The title of the article in the paper is "Old Chains Are Breakable." And if you notice the title of the sermon, I stole the title from their article. The article is written by L.Z. Granderson, who writes for the Los Angeles Times. And in the article, he reminds us of some things that Martin Luther King Jr. said in a Meet the Press interview in 1960. Martin Luther King said, "I think it's one of the tragedies of our nation, one of the shameful tragedies, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours, if not the most segregated hour in Christian America." Also in that interview, MLK said, "Any church that stands against integration and that has a segregated body is standing against the Spirit and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it fails to be a true witness. But this is something the church will have to do itself." In the article, Granderson also includes a quote from the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass from his 1845 memoir. So Douglass wrote that memoir before the Civil War. He said, "The difference between Christianity in this land, America, and the Christianity of Christ I recognize the widest possible difference. And I'm sure it was a pretty glaring difference, right? Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. were both right. And they called out the church for its historic failure to oppose racism and be united as the interracial people of God. Now, the positive note in Granderson's article comes when he brings attention to a new musical group that was formed in 2018 called Maverick City Music. I don't know if anybody has heard them. When I mentioned it to Alan, he said he had. So, Tony Brown and Jonathan Jay wanted to create space for diversity by including often marginalized creatives, such as black people and women, who identified as contemporary Christian music singers and songwriters. So they brought them together in this cooperative. And Granderson says he immediately fell in love with their musical sound. But then, when he watched the video of their single, Man of Your Word, he found, and I quote, not only hypnotized by their unbridled joy in worship, but by the kaleidoscope of their humanity. This is what the church was meant to look like. Unquote. So I watched the video, and I had a similar response to the unbridled joy in their singing and to the kaleidoscope of their group. The words of the song, Man of Your Word, include these. You're a man of your word. Here we go. This is what it says. All things are possible when we believe. Old chains are breakable when we receive. Yahweh, you keep your promises. And if you said it, we believe it. And for about 8 minutes, they go back and forth. If you said it, we believe it. If you said it, we believe it. Indeed, old chains are breakable when we believe. And when we receive from God His power and His love and His promises. And I pray that our congregation will continue to be part of the solution to the problem of racism as we love one another and as we live in harmony as one body. Let's model for the world how God's people can stand together, hand in hand, and side by side. God's people of all backgrounds and colors, bound by God's love and by God's grace poured out to all of us. And Psalm 133, verse 1 begins, how good and pleasant is it when God's people live together in unity. And don't you know, it makes God so happy when His people live together in unity. Amen.